Welcome to this week's episode of Her Education, the podcast. Today on the show, we have a women's health topic, or I guess it is women's health topic, but normally every month we do like a women's health topic or a practical topic. Haven't really dived too far into the women's health topic specifically just yet because I just haven't. But I've been doing a lot of research around hormones lately and the menstrual cycle and fertility health, and then basically kind of like looking at how all these systems are affected at certain health conditions and what it means to regulate them. Anyway, so basically there's a lot of other different topics that I think are super cool that I'd love to talk about on the podcast, or at least sort of read a little bit more about and share some content with you, whether that's here or whether that's on through social media and like Instagram, social media. And basically I thought like most of those topics require like some level or baseline level of knowledge around the menstrual cycle and like understanding the physiology of the process involved. So basically I wanted to create like this podcast episode on a menstrual cycle 101 that basically covers what happens in your menstrual cycle, and maybe you'll learn something new on this, maybe you won't, maybe you've never even looked into the menstrual cycle and this is completely new to you, but I wanted it to be like the reference point for when I talk about it in the future. I don't have to dive deep into it. You can always come back to this as a refresher. And basically, I also just really love this topic. And I think that female hormones and the menstrual cycle is such an incredible process. And I just love it. So I wanted to share about it anyway and talk about it. And I also find that many of my clients don't know anything about their menstrual cycle. And if they do, it's very basic. So when I'm talking to them a lot about like symptom changes in their menstrual cycle, which is super common in the pelvic health world, then they kind of don't really get it. And they've never tracked their cycle, so they don't know whether their symptoms are aligned with different parts of their cycle. So I have to go through a bit of education around it. And I think the more I know about this and its intricacies, the easier it has been for me to actually communicate what it is for my clients, because I found that sometimes if you only know the basics, it's really hard to kind of re-explain things in a different way. But once you sort of dive a little bit deeper or you understand it a bit more, I don't know, maybe it's just because I've explained it much more than I have previously and I'm getting better at it, who knows. But I really find that this information is just really helpful. And I hope that maybe you also find this really educational and useful for yourself, and maybe you can learn something from this. So let's get started. Let's dive into the topic. So first of all, I also want to highlight that in the midst of Google searching and reading other things and many different things around the menstrual cycle, the phases involved, what the hormones do, this system or this process is so complex that I feel like there's a lot of information where I'm like, but that said this and this said that, and like, is it actually that, or they kind of contradict each other, or like, is it 2 phases? Is it 4 phases of the menstrual cycle? Like, is it 5? Like, I've read so many different things about it that one, I think you probably have to look into who's actually writing it, but also like, I think it's also like, I see this from my perspective now and how I view it. And I think that's probably what I'm going to tell you to take away from this. This is how I view the menstrual cycle. And I mean, there is obviously a physiological process that's you can't change, but this is how I view it in a sense of how I would explain it to people and what's involved and what I find is really relevant to learn as an EP or fitness professional or allied health professional, whatever that you might be in. So if you find yourself in the same scenario where you feel like you've read so many different things that sometimes things contradict each other, like, I know how you feel. And I guess that's the problem with the world of research and the world of Google. So if there's something that doesn't align with what you've read here before, then that could be another reason, or correct me if I'm wrong. Now, when I actually dived a little bit deeper into female hormones and the menstrual cycle and the ins and outs of the physiology, I kind of then readjusted how I viewed the menstrual cycle. And instead of being just like one cycle, I kind of picture it like 2 separate things now. So 2 cycles that fall into what happens within the ovaries and then what happens within the uterus, or so we can refer to these as like an ovarian cycle and an endometrial cycle. So the ovarian cycle is describing what happens in the ovaries, and that typically is responsible for like all of the hormonal signaling that happens between like the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the ovaries. And then we can consider the endometrial cycle or the uterine cycle, whatever you want to call that, as what's happening in the uterus sort of alongside what's happening in the ovaries. And this is often in response to the hormonal cascades that the ovaries are experiencing, which also then stimulate the uterus, or the endometrial lining, shall we say, because that's pretty much what the uterus is about at this point. So yeah, that's how I view them. So 2 different cycles. Now, the endometrium is a very complex reproductive part of the organ that is in, I guess, the absence of pregnancy, undergoes a process of tissue shedding and really rapid repair within the month. And this process happens without any loss of function, as well as no form of like injury or scarring. So it involves inflammation, it involves formation of new blood vessels, it involves tissue remodeling and formation of new tissues. And it's technically like a monthly cycle of being wounded and rapidly repaired. And I just like want to take a moment to actually let that sink in, because before I sort of dove into this, I was like, oh yeah, like bleeding from uterus, like, ooh. And now I think about it like, wow, it's actually like going through this process of like building and rapidly degenerating or like breaking down and healing again every month. Like, that's nuts. And it doesn't like lose its function at the same time. Like, I mean, so cool. Anyway, when we think about the menstrual cycle, the endometrium goes through that endometrial cycle, and this can be broken down into like a secretory phase, whatever you want to call it. Sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing these words, and the proliferative phase. So that's basically what's happening with the tissue. So building and breaking down, basically. And that happens alongside the ovarian cycle, which is then broken down into your phases of the menstrual cycle that you would typically know. And that could be, I don't know, you could break that into 2 phases if you want to, or you could break it into 4 phases, which is typically menses or your period, the follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. So I want to talk about that second cycle involved in the menstrual cycle. So the ovarian cycle, but typically what we actually know is happening. And that's sort of like the main thing that happens, but I want you to consider the endometrial cycle as another separate thing that happens as well. So the ovarian cycle basically describes what's happening in the ovaries and the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis, or the HPO axis, or in some cases you'll read it as the HPG axis, because in males, this is the same thing, and it's referred to as gonads, or gonads is for both of us, really. They're just our, which particular organ we're talking about. Now, the HPO axis, like I said, consists of the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the ovaries. And there's a very tightly regulated cascade of events that drive the menstrual cycle in this axis. Now, the hypothalamus, we're going to start here. So this is all probably from the beginning. So let's start it from like day 1 of your menstrual cycle, which is the day you start bleeding. Now, obviously it's a cycle thing, so it leads up to that, but the hypothalamus typically is going to be releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which triggers the anterior pituitary gland to secrete 2 hormones. So it's going to start secreting luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. So you've got LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicular stimulating hormone, FSH. So those 2 are coming from the anterior pituitary gland in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Now, these hormones, luteinizing hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, are primarily responsible for then traveling down to the ovaries to signal a cascade of events inside the ovary that ultimately release a subset of immature follicles and stimulate them to grow and mature into primary follicles. And only one of those becomes the dominant follicle, which actually ovulates. But we'll get into that later. So we have all of these, I guess, immature follicles sitting in the ovaries, and they start to grow in response to FSH and LH. Now, let's break down this cycle into its distinct phases. I personally use 2 phases. Follicular phase, which is typically day 1 to 14. Luteal phase, typically day 14 to 28. Now, you can also divide this further into 4 phases, which adds in menses, which is day 1 to day 7. So technically that's in your follicular phase. And then ovulation, which is basically sandwiched between your follicular phase and your luteal phase. So you could break that up into 4 phases if you want to. I personally just find it really easy to umbrella ovulation and menses within the two main phases because I like to keep it a bit more simple, especially when I'm explaining it to clients. It's a really complex process. So keeping it really easy for them is a safer option. And I find as soon as you start chucking in all these other extra phases, it just gets a little bit confusing. Anyway, follicular phase. In the follicular phase, the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone triggers a steady state release of LH and FSH from that pituitary gland. And so, as such, that then stimulates the follicles in the ovaries to grow. And as they grow, they start to produce estrogen inside the ovary. So ovaries are becoming more estrogen dense in the sense of the concentration. Now, the presence of estrogen at lower levels, which is in sort of the first 1 to 10 days of the cycle, acts as a negative feedback system back up to the pituitary gland and signals or tells the pituitary gland to not produce too much luteinizing hormone or follicular stimulating hormone. And as such, that sort of stays at a pretty steady level in terms of the concentration in the blood. So a bit of that estrogen that gets developed in the ovaries kind of filters out into the blood, travels up to the pituitary gland and tells it, hey, calm down on your LH and FSH. We only need a little bit. And as the follicles actually continue to grow, they start to produce more and more estrogen. And as a result, that concentration of estrogen really starts to rise and becomes a lot higher inside the ovaries. And then as some of that estrogen then is released back into the blood stream, it will then travel back up to the pituitary gland. And instead of acting as a negative feedback system where it's saying like calm down on production, the high concentration of estrogen actually is more of a positive feedback loop on the pituitary gland to secrete more luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And there is a really dramatic rise in luteinizing hormone at this time. And that is what is actually triggering that most mature follicle to actually ovulate. So you get a little bit of a rise in follicle stimulating hormone, but it's not as high as your luteinizing hormone. So you get that ovulation period is approximately day 14 of the cycle. And the egg, or the oocyte, which is technically its name, that is housed inside the follicle, is then released out of the ovary into the fallopian tube to go on its next journey. This process basically requires the follicle to bind up against the ovarian membrane, rupture, and release the egg into the fallopian tubes. So this rupturing process is actually inflammatory in nature, which is also really important to know because it becomes really important for things like fertility health when we're looking at optimizing fertility health. If you don't want too low inflammation because that might be a problem, but you actually do need it at that point. So, and there is pain associated with that in some people. They do actually feel the pain associated with the rupturing of the follicle. I don't get it, so I don't really, I get it, but I don't actually experience that, so I'm pretty glad. But I have had a lot of clients that also experience that. Now, the ruptured follicle actually remains inside the ovary and turns into the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum has a very important role of producing progesterone, as well as small amounts of inhibin and estrogen. So when we look at why progesterone is being produced, it's really, really important for aiding in the endometrial lining and growth as well as estrogen. And it acts as a negative feedback system to the hypothalamus so that it reduces gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then in response, the pituitary gland won't actually release FSH or LH. And there's no like follicle maturation signaling process happening there. So we don't want any more follicles being stimulated. So we need to actually reduce those hormones. So the excess progesterone goes up to the hypothalamus and acts to downregulate that system. So that's what progesterone is really important for there, as well as endometrial tissue growth and controlling the amount of that. Now, inhibin, that's also produced by the corpus luteum, is produced to act as a negative feedback loop to the pituitary gland, alongside obviously progesterone to the hypothalamus, to keep FSH and LH also in a low state and prevent follicles from maturation, in the case that fertilization might occur. So you've got inhibin and progesterone acting to stop that cascade of events, acting to continually or, signal to the ovaries to start maturing more follicles. Now, then we also have estrogen. Estrogen is produced by corpus luteum, and it is responsible for endometrial tissue growth. So we want the lining of the endometrium to really start growing, being thick, being really nourishing, and be ready and prepared for any sort of implantation and hopefully pregnancy. So that's really important in the second half of the menstrual cycle. So the second half of the ovarian cycle is from that ovulation phase into, I guess, what we will call as menses, which is where the endometrial lining actually starts to break down. But that is where progesterone is really high. We've got estrogen levels are not as high as progesterone, but they're still quite there because they're coming out of that corpus luteum as well. We also have a few little inhibin levels as well, but we then also have low levels of FSH and low levels of luteinizing hormone as well. So that is your second phase, which is your luteal phase. So follicular phase, number one phase, responsible for follicle growth and maturation, ovulation, sandwiched between the two phases. Egg is released into the fallopian tubes. Second half of luteal phase, and this is responsible for corpus luteum and I guess breakdown, which is in itself an organ secreting hormones, which is pretty cool. And it's slowly breaking down, as well as obviously endometrial tissue growth. Now that's also happening in phase one as well, but this is where all the hormones are really high in phase two. Now, in the case that fertilization does not occur, and the corpus luteum has been producing all of this progesterone, and it's been producing inhibin, and it's been producing estrogen, we get a it continues through those days to degrade, and the secretion of those hormones also starts to decline. So that would then have the effect on those same concepts of why they're there. So progesterone can no longer inhibit that gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So it is now you're actually starting to release more gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and that's then going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to start back releasing luteinizing hormone, follicular stimulating hormone. So that's where that comes from. There's less levels of inhibin. So that's then also having that cascade effect of no longer, I guess, that negative feedback system at the pituitary gland. And then we also have low levels of progesterone. So progesterone and estrogen start to decrease as that corpus luteum degrades. And this means that the endometrial lining cannot actually be maintained because those hormones are signaling to the uterine lining to do its thing and be really sort of thick and nourishing. And that cannot be maintained. So in the presence that these hormones start to drop off from the corpus luteum, then that means the shedding of the endometrial lining happens because it can't be maintained anymore. And this is what we then call the period. And this is when the whole cycle starts again. So that is basically the hormonal physiology behind a menstrual cycle that does not, I guess, that keeps happening, that doesn't, there's no pregnancy, shall we say. Now, let's talk about what happens if you are pregnant. What happens? So if fertilization does occur, a zygote, which is basically your fertilized egg with sperm in the fallopian tubes, then works its way down and implants into the endometrium. So now all of that tissue that's been developed inside the uterus, is now ready for implantation. So that zygote can then go into the wall, be snug, start growing into what will be a baby. Now, when that actually happens, so when the implantation into the endometrium actually happens, we start to secrete the hormone called human chorionic, I don't even know what it is, HCG, basically, which is your like pregnancy hormones. This is one that they test in your urine. It's like human chorionic gonadotropin or whatever it is. I'm so terrible with the words, so please do not judge me and just enjoy the comic side of hormones. And then this actually communicates back to the corpus luteum to continue releasing hormones. So that means we're going to keep producing lots of progesterone and estrogen so that the maintenance of that uterine lining can be maintained, and continue into pregnancy. So that's how we start basically that presence of those higher progesterone levels are going to keep regulating the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in that case. But then also you have this new HCG hormone, and then a million other things start to happen, which also change hormonal signaling. But for the simplicity of this podcast, that is what is happening. Now, the placenta begins to grow as well. And as that develops, that it becomes the more driving force of hormone secretion behind pregnancy, including HCG and progesterone and estrogen, along with a million other things that it does. So once that corpus luteum basically doesn't really need to produce those hormones anymore, it'll eventually just degrade like it normally does. And the ovaries won't experience that HPO axis of FSH and LH in the same process that happens during menstruation, because you've got all the hormones coming from the placenta, and that's signaling to the body that you don't need to go have a menstrual cycle anymore. And that's why you don't have a menstrual cycle for, I guess, the 9 months that you're pregnant and therefore into the future. So there you have it. That is menstrual cycle lesson 101, or at least how I see it anyway, and how I like to communicate it with, I don't go into that much detail with my clients at all, but I like to know all the ins and outs of things. So if that actually helps you understand that. I hope you've actually learned something from this episode. I will be touching on the menstrual cycle in the future. Don't know when, but I will be. And I don't really want to have to dive into the physiology behind it every single time we talk about it. So hopefully you can come back to this as a reference point. I personally found it a really long time to get my head around all of this. And even now I still have to make notes on the changes of hormones, because I feel like there's 1,000 things happening and I can't remember which ones get high and which ones get low sometimes, but I find that like having it written down is also super helpful for me. So maybe if you were to do that, you might find it really helpful to write this down as well. But otherwise, if you found some value in this, I'd really appreciate you letting me know, because when I hear your feedback around the podcast and what it does for you, it really helps me realize that I'm not just talking to no one, number one. And number two, I'm just really passionate about sharing this, and I want to be able to help anyone out there that wants to learn more. So that's why I'm sharing this. So please let me know. I'd love it. And if you think that this would be helpful for anyone else that you know, please share the show, because I have goals around building a really cool community of people that really care about all of this stuff, and basically reaching as many people as I can to bring in the really cool ones, because anyone that's listening to this, I consider cool anyway. But basically, I'd love to grow this. So that's my intention. So if you would like to help me do that, feel free to share this among your community. Maybe your client would be, I guess, interested in this. I know the super athletic population usually are, or people that just generally care about women's health or their own health. So you could share that with them, or your coworkers, or your community if you have other people that follow you. So I'd really appreciate that. Otherwise, thank you for still being here and listening. It really does mean a lot to me. I really appreciate it. And I will catch you in the next one. Bye.